been in churches any amount of time, particularly if we're women, we might have found ourselves asked this question: who are you, Mary or Martha? The traditional approach to this story, particularly if we're women, is that some of us are the kind of person who gets distracted by all the tasks that daily life might require, and some of us know what's important. I've asked that question myself. I've set up that binary. I've done Bible studies this way. But it's only lately that I've come to see the question as taking us down a less than helpful path. It's only lately that I see this binary as downright dangerous. The question reduces this story to a morality tale that tells women not to fuss over the housework, but to shut up and sit down at the feet of the learned men that are in our orbit. If we're lucky, it's somebody like Jesus. If we're not so lucky, it's somebody else who's willing to take advantage of us. It's only lately that I went back to the text to look up some of the words that have been mistranslated, 2 words specifically. If we change the words to ones that are more faithful to the original, the story shifts significantly. The first word is the one that describes what Martha is doing in verse 40. In our text, we see Martha distracted by her many tasks. Task is a word that makes me think of the work that needs to be done, but the work that isn't really terribly important in the longer run. It's housework or maintenance of buildings or cars, for example. Other translations have a similar approach. The New International Version says, but Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. The Message translation is even more specific. But Martha was pulled away by all that she had to do in the kitchen. In the kitchen. However, the Greek word means something totally different. It's not the word that Greeks would use for that kind of work. The Greek word for what Martha is doing is diakonia. It's spelled D-I-A-K-O-N-I-A. It's the word from which we get deacon, which is an important position in many churches. And you might say, well, sure, that's how we use it now, but is that the way they used it in the first century? And the answer is yes. It was also used that way in the time that the Gospel of Luke was written and earlier. It's a word that has been linked to ministry, particularly the ministry that serves others. It's a word that's used to describe, according to my Greek Blue Letter Bible translation that helps me with these things, because I do not have this knowledge of Greek. But it's been used to describe those who, by the command of God, proclaim and promote religion among people, a word used across the Bible, a word linked to the office of Moses, for example, the office of apostles and administration, the office of prophets, evangelists, and elders. So the work that is distracting Martha is likely not the work in the kitchen like we might think of. She's not in the kitchen putting a meal together for Jesus, probably. She's not back there fussing over the dinner. She might be managing others who are cooking for the larger community. She's not cleaning the house hoping that Jesus doesn't see what a sloppy housekeeper she is, although she may be managing others who are taking care of housekeeping for the larger community. According to many Bible scholars, the more accurate translation is that she is doing the work of the church. It might involve service, as the work of the church so often does, but it is not busy work. It is not inconsequential work. It is not women's work, which has so often been dismissed as frivolous or so lacking in skill that anybody can do it. In Roman times, that would be the work that was relegated to slaves, for example. It is diakonia, which leads several New Testament scholars to suggest that Martha is a much more important figure in early church history than centuries of patriarchal teaching have given her credit for being. One of the first Christians, perhaps. I should preface all of this by saying we don't know as much as I often wish that we knew, right? Martha did not leave a journal, which we discover in some old vessel waiting for us. We have to piece together in ways that are interesting to me. We've often given credit to the sister Mary for being one of the first leaders of the church, too, and that may also be true. We think that probably because she's there sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening intently. We assume that she's listening intently so she can go out and share this teaching of Jesus with others. And Jesus says that what Jesus says about what she's doing also leads us to think that she's doing important work, perhaps even leadership work. And the translation that we're using reinforces this belief. Listen again to that last sentence, as it is in the text that I read, and then we'll talk about a translation. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. Did you catch that adjective? The better part. Through the centuries, these words have been used to further belittle women's work, the kind of work we unreflectively suppose that Martha has been doing in the kitchen. But better is not an accurate translation. The word in Greek is good. Not better, good. Listen again and see how the meaning shifts. It's subtle, but significant. Mary has chosen the good part, which will not be taken away from her. It's not a competition. Better makes us think competition, right? Mary made the better choice. Mary's smarter than Martha. And I don't think that that's what we're supposed to think. One way of serving is not better than another. However, Jesus may be saying that one mindset is better than another. Jesus tells Martha that she worries about many things, and the implication is that all of these issues that cause her anxiety are not the important ones. And it's a story that many of us, with our increasingly hectic lives, we need to hear again and again, maybe every day. We need to be reminded to stay alert. Busyness is the drug that many of us use to dull our senses. Maybe you're like me. I really like going through my to-do list and checking things off. Sometimes I add things that I know that I'm going to get to do so I can have the pleasure of checking them off. Jesus is speaking to me here. In our busyness, we forget what's really important. We forget to focus on Christ and living the way that Christ commanded us. And I know you might be thinking, well, why don't you add Bible study, sermon prep, those things to the list? But that too loses the point. Jesus is here to tell us to leave those lists behind and focus on him. The story of Mary and Martha is often summed up as Martha does housework, Mary meditates at the feet of Jesus, and we should figure out a way to combine these approaches. That's not a bad way of looking at the story, but it still, I think, leaves us in competition with which way is better. In some ways, this interpretation gets to part of what the story teaches us, but it can also lose the fact that all of our busyness takes us away from God. It's true, regardless of the work that's keeping us frazzled. Maybe it's the chores of daily life. Maybe it's our caretaking duties. Maybe it's the work that we do for pay, our volunteer work, and it's also quite possible church work. Martha's work, paradoxically, takes her attention away from God, and it would not be the first time that we have seen Jesus enter into the middle of this conflict between God's hope for us, for our flourishing, and religious politics and expectations. Most of us, I'm guessing, have been trained to see this story as a tale of two women, one frivolous and one serious. But it's far more likely that both of these women are early disciples of Jesus. And in fact, we will see Martha again in the Gospel of John. There's lots of debate currently about whether this Mary and Martha are the same Mary and Martha in John, who have a brother Lazarus at that point, and they're living somewhere else. And there's lots of question about, is that some mistranslation? What happened to Lazarus in Luke? But let us say that this Mary and Martha are the same Mary and Martha in John. And if so, John was written later, and Martha is one of the first in the Gospel of John who proclaims Jesus as Messiah. She does this a few chapters after the Samaritan woman at the well also claims Jesus as Messiah. And in between there is Peter, who claims that Jesus is the Messiah. My New Testament teacher of the class in Luke that I taught said that we could see this Mary and Martha story in Luke as the call story of Martha, that Jesus calls her to focus on what's important, and some decades later, when the Gospel of John is written, she's done it, right? She has answered the call, and she is there to proclaim Jesus as Lord. So it is far better, I think, to see this story as one that shows us how to serve, both others and ourselves. There are two ways. Today, I've focused on Martha and her work. There's also Mary, contemplative, sitting at the feet of Jesus. This story flows into next week's gospel about the Lord's Prayer. So we will be talking more about contemplation and prayer next week, and looking at several chapters in Luke as going together and telling us how to be disciples. Today's story, Martha's story, is a story that reminds us to ask ourselves, what is a good choice? And the good choice in one setting may not be the same in every situation. Jesus calls to us today, just as he called to Mary and to Martha in this story. How can we be more fully present to the presence of God? How can we learn to ignore all the work that calls us away from the good part, the sitting at the feet of Jesus, doing nothing else but listening? Jesus wants to set Martha free from her worries and distractions. Jesus wants the same for us. Let this be the season where we say yes to this liberation, yes to each other, yes to Jesus.